joining us from all parts of the United States and the world. It's sadly hard to think of a more timely moment to be having conversations around violence, gun violence, and violence prevention, and how we attend to issues around the epidemic of violence and bringing a public health lens that acknowledges that starting point to these issues. Yet again, yesterday, the United States experienced for the second time in under a week the tragic consequences of gun violence through a mass shooting. And it's too often that we see that in our country. And I think we very much embrace the notion that there's quite a bit to be learned from other parts of the world and from those who have been grappling with these issues. So I want to thank all of you who are joining us for this conversation. I believe that we have individuals with us from over a dozen countries. I saw individuals would be participating from Uganda, the UK, South Africa, Canada, Mexico, the Netherlands, and obviously the United States as well. I'm the founder and executive director of Fair and Just Prosecution, and we have the privilege to work with and support a network of elected prosecutors around the United States, including DA Eric Gonzalez in Brooklyn, who we'll be hearing from today. These are leaders who are part of a growing movement in prosecution of elected, new, bold thinkers committed to a justice system that is grounded in fairness and equity and compassion, and it recognizes the need for new thinking and to move away from the notion that we can punish our way out of every problem. And instead, we need to think smartly about how we shrink the size of our criminal legal system and embrace public health strategies, as well as other proven models. We have the joy to have collaborated on this panel with Michael Kahn and his colleagues at the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Michael is the executive director of the IIP, and he and his team bring together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies with cutting-edge scholarship and innovative thinking. Michael and I will be co-moderating with this great group of experts that Michael will be introducing. And with that, Michael, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you to the entire FJP team for all the work you do and for helping to put this together. Miriam and I, along with these incredible panelists that I'll introduce in a moment, are thrilled to speak with you today about how practitioners in the criminal legal system, in order to meaningfully decarcerate, promote public safety, and advance racial equity, must implement new responses to violent crime. Today, we'll discuss new models of violence prevention that use public health strategies to build safer and healthier communities. To have that conversation, I'm so pleased to be joined by this incredible panel. I'm going to give brief bios, but they certainly do not do justice to any of these esteemed panelists. We have Deanna Hoskins, who's the president of Just Leadership USA. Just Leadership USA is dedicated to cutting the US correctional population in half by 2030 and empowers people most affected by incarceration to drive policy reform. Thank you, Deanna, and welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce District Attorney Eric Gonzalez. Eric Gonzalez is the elected district attorney in Kings County, Brooklyn, New York. He made history in November 2017 when he became the first Latino district attorney elected in New York State. DA Gonzalez launched a groundbreaking initiative known as Justice 2020 to help him carry out his vision of keeping Brooklyn safe and strengthening trust in the justice system by ensuring fairness and equal justice for all. Thank you very much and welcome, DA Gonzalez. Aram Barra is the program officer for the Open Society Foundation's Latin American program. He recently focused on developing the Instinto de Vida campaign in the seven most lethal countries in Latin America, promoting public policies that help reduce the incidence of homicide. Thank you and welcome, Aram. And last but certainly not least, Andrew Papachristos is professor of sociology at Northwestern University, Evanston, Illinois, and also serves as director of the Northwestern Neighborhood and Network Initiative. Through his research, Andrew aims to understand how the connected nature of cities, how their citizens, neighborhoods, and institutions are tied to one another, affect what we feel, think, and do. Thank you so much and welcome, Andrew. And to kick off our conversation, I'm going to start by turning to Deanna. And ask her to help situate the context of today's conversation. I'd like to just start off, Deanna, by asking you a pretty straightforward question. How has the US criminal legal system failed to adequately address violence?
Thank you, Michael. You know, I was thinking about this question and a couple of things came to mind. When we think about the US criminal legal system and violence, is traditionally the response has been, how do we impact and prevent marginalized communities from actually committing violent crimes, right? We know in certain communities, 85% of the crime violence that's being committed is committed by 0.5% of the population. But the response from police in those communities are in a violent action. But then you have a situation like yesterday in Boulder, Colorado, where we discovered that this individual was able to obtain a gun in the same day, right? There was no waiting period. In this country, you can't register and vote in the same day. But this individual was allowed to register and obtain a gun that he then subsequently opened a fire inside a grocery store. So when we look at how the US legal system has failed to adequately address violence, it depends on who we're responding to and who we think we're preventing from committing the violence. Again, in our communities, they show up very violently. I'm gonna be honest with you, and when you said set the context for this, had that been an African-American man who opened fire in that grocery store, he would not have been arrested, and we all know that. So let's really just talk about it. We have had Black men stopped for a front license plate and not leave that situation alive. So when you look at the legal system, getting into the system, the prosecution, law enforcement, the interaction of who they're interacting with around the terms of violence really actually demonstrates it. And I think January 6th also demonstrated another thing. We've been talking about law enforcement needs training around de-escalation. I think January 6th demonstrated to us they know how to de-escalate. They know how to provide law enforcement customer service. It was demonstrated when they actually marched rioters out of the Capitol, escorted them out. But again, when you look at our urban communities, African Americans, not even having a violent act, end up in a violent confrontation with law enforcement versus another race committing a violent act, and how law enforcement and the legal system responds to them is blatantly shows the disparities in that interaction altogether.
Thank you very much. I think that's really helpful context and particularly important and poignant for today. One thing I just wanted to follow up on is, you certainly mentioned some of the disparities in the system and where the system hasn't acted, but I would love if you could touch on the ways in which the system also fails to address the underlying causes and cyclical nature of crime when it does act affirmatively.
So when it does act and the underlying causes, so we know that hurt people. And a lot of times the act came out in a violent way, but what was the underlying issue? Was this a person who possibly experienced and learned violence? We talk about urban communities of sometimes our communities are violent. Growing up in poverty sometimes is a violent behavior. When the police respond to us, it's in a violent nature. They're removing someone, they're addressing someone in our communities. So how, for me, or for formerly incarcerated, it's how the legal system responds to us that perpetrates that violence that we're talking about in our communities, and how they respond to us in a violent way. I think there was an advocate one time that says, if you're saying communities of color perpetrate violence in the communities, it's because we learned it from law enforcement. Let's look at the history of law enforcement and how some law enforcement respond to us in those communities.
Thank you very much, Deanna. And I think that's a really helpful framing for the top of this conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to Miriam.
Thanks, Deanna. And Eric, I'd like to bring your voice into the conversation. I think Deanna so eloquently underscored the human element and the personal way that we need to think about these issues, because they really do hit home. What is violence but the impact on individuals that we have to constantly bear in mind. And I know that you're not simply the elected DA in Brooklyn, but you're also someone who personally has experienced the impact of violence, and would like to have you talk about that and how through that impact you've had a window into the way the system responds and sometimes too often fails, and the role of prosecutors and how they struggle with attending to these issues and not just going to their autopilot of punishing their way out of these issues.
Well, thank you, Miriam. It's important to understand that, when I grew up in Brooklyn in the 80s and 90s, I grew up in East New York in Brooklyn, which was, historically one of the most challenging parts of New York City. In fact, my precinct was considered the murder capital of New York City, with the most number of shootings and homicides during this period of time. So having a lot of friends who were part of the criminal legal system, either as a victim of a terrible crime or a perpetrator of violence, is something that I grew up with. And quite frankly, I became a prosecutor, or wanted to be involved in prosecution, because I never believed that the justice system actually understood the needs of the community. The needs of the community to feel safe, and obviously people think they understand what that means in terms of everyone wants to live in safe communities, but exactly how you get there, and what we witnessed in Brooklyn, especially coming through the crack cocaine period of time, was the mass incarceration of people. So it further alienated people from prosecutors' offices, from law enforcement, and it created a system by which people had very little faith that the system actually could keep them safe. But more importantly, that whether or not, as Deanna talked about, the system had its best interest, their best interest, our best interest at heart. And we are struggling with that to this day. We struggle with the fact that more than 50% of the people who are victims of crime in Brooklyn are non-responsive to either the police or to prosecutors. And I think that number is even closer to 70%. They don't like what prosecutors are offering in terms of the tools to keep them safe and to improve the quality of life. And so what you have is a system that actually does not meet the needs or understand the concerns of people. It's not that people don't want to be safe. It's that we also understand that warehousing generations of young people, especially Black and Latino men, is destructive to our communities, to our families. So we reject it. And so we don't participate in the traditional public safety protocols that are in place that may work in some places. As a result of that distrust, and not even getting to the issues that Deanna talked about, the violence committed against communities of color, the continuation of crime continues. It becomes a cycle. There's trauma, and what we see is quite clearly, growing up in Brooklyn, I could tell you which of my friends would be criminally justice involved just simply by the social networks of friends that they kept. And so, learning all of that is something that is taking us a long time to deal with, because our response to ordinary crime is simply to say, well, we'll make it safer, we'll make it better, just because we're going to incarcerate someone. And I think that is really at the root cause of why people don't feel that there's a criminal legal system that works in communities of color. They're not interested in what prosecutors in particular are telling them is the only way we're able to keep them safe.
Thanks, Eric. And we're going to come back in a little bit to that notion of how we think about those social networks and and how indicative they are of the risks that we see in certain neighborhoods among certain communities. But I think I'd like to, before then, Aram, bring your voice into the conversation. You have a chance
Mary,
to.
I'm sorry, Mary. I just also like to say that the conversations that we are currently having are really thinking. I just kind of said what I witnessed and what I experienced as both a person, as a young prosecutor, but the solutions to how we're going to get there, I think we're starting to see a lot of the solutions today. We're starting to see how we can actually address these underlying causes of, that lead to people committing crime. And I think there actually is a path forward that we can get to. And I hope that we get a chance to talk about this today.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Eric, for that. We are going to come back to you and ask you in a short bit to talk about some of those solutions, because I do think that your office has modeled how an elected prosecutor can embrace a different way of thinking through those solutions. But let me, Aram, go back to you. I think it's so critical for those of us who practice in the United States to expand our horizons beyond our borders and to be able to look at work that's being done in other parts of the world. And you have certainly done, along with colleagues of yours at the Open Society Foundation, some incredible work in being able to understand what goes on in those other parts of the world. In particular, you've looked at homicide reduction in Latin America. So talk to us about what you've learned in terms of how violence behaves so much like an epidemic, and why it's important to use that public health lens as we try to understand these issues.
Thanks, Miriam, and thanks to the co-panelists and everyone involved for organizing this conversation. I agree with you. Sort of widening the scope of the conversation in terms of geography is really interesting, because it allows to sort of cross different good practice and sort of experiences. What I can say off the bat first about Latin America is that even though it's a fairly small percentage of the global population in Latin America, there are about 8% of the global population lives in Latin America. Yet we have 38% of the killings of murders that go on around the world, and that is highly impressive, particularly for a region that is not formally at war. None of the countries since the peace agreement of Colombia in 2016, there's no ongoing war in the region. Out of those 38% of the killings that take place, of the global killings that take place in Latin America, 34% take place in either Brazil, Colombia, El Salvador, Honduras, or Guatemala. Mexico and Venezuela, which is the 7 countries where the campaign Instinto de Vida that was mentioned at the beginning sort of focuses. Just to put this into perspective, these numbers sort of amount to a homicide taking place in the region every 15 minutes. That's around 400 killings a day, every day. And that's about 2.6 million people since the year 2000. On top of that, if you take a look at the different listings of violent cities, 43 out of the 50 most violent and homicidal cities in the world are in Latin America. And so, with that sort of context, we decided to engage with a couple of organizations that had been looking at these numbers and wanted to ensure that that the issue was paid more attention to. There are, and I'll come to your question now, I think there are several socioeconomic risk factors that exacerbate homicidal violence in Latin America. One that is a typical answer for most politicians and decision makers across the region is youth unemployment, which is strongly correlated with murder. So having said that, though, it is not necessarily a function of unemployment per se, but rather, youth inactivity and poor job quality that explains why individuals resort to violence. Additionally, there are weak social mobility, which across the region is related not only to the increase in overall crime rates, but also to violent deaths in certain contexts. An important thing to say, particularly if we are going to move down in this conversation down to sort of engaging in that exchange of practice and lessons learned, I think it is important to highlight that another very important risk factor for homicide across Latin America is linked to weak institutions. And there's several studies, I'm not going to quote them just in the interest of time, but I'm happy to provide some links. There's a bunch of studies talking about different institutions, right? So in relation to the criminal justice system, for instance, there's very, very low clearance rates of homicides, which makes people hesitate or doubt whether those institutions work and justice can be served. In the Americas, so in difference to other regions of the world, for instance, Asia and Europe, where clearance rates range from 80% to 85%, in the case of murder, in the Americas, the proportion falls to 50% and below 10% in some countries, particularly in the northern triangle of Central America. Impunity rate for homicides in Mexico, for instance, accounts for about 80%. In Colombia, it recently rose to 96% between 2005 and 2010. And in Honduras and Brazil, the rate is 92%. Venezuela, 92% out of 100 cases in homicides do not result in any arrest. All of this to say, there's a generalized lack of confidence in public institutions by Latin American citizens. Just 4 out of 10 citizens have faith in the police. 3 out of 10 say that they trust judges and the wider judicial system. So, very, very low confidence. There's also significant challenges for public authorities to responsibly regulate firearms, purchasing, ownership, and use and trafficking throughout the region, in connection with what Deanna was saying at the beginning. About 80% of crime scenes in Mexico and Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have guns that show up that were either illegally or illegally imported or trafficked from the US. So, there's certainly a conversation to be had in terms of gun regulation in the US and the impact that has in the prevalence of gun violence across the Americas, particularly in Mexico and Central America. In fact, the percentage of homicides committed using firearms is slightly higher in Latin America than the global average of 41%. In the case of South America, it raises from that 41% to 59%. And in the case of Central America, it rises to 73%. I think, generally, and I'll make maybe 2 more points, several of these driving or these factors that drive homicide rates are related to extreme violence, but there's also an overall sort of argument that this conversation, particularly in Latin America, tends to fall under, which is all of this is correlated or related to organized crime and gangs. And even though it is true that a high or an important proportion of violence is related to that, it is certainly not the only source of violence, and it isn't at this point the most dominant source of violence. There is considerable interpersonal and intimate partner violence. Through statistics on the motivation of crime are still weak across the region. We know that particularly in the pandemic from several cities. And in this sense, the normalization of violence and the widespread public tolerance for using violence to solve conflict contributes in itself to higher than average homicide rates. There's lastly, obviously, the consequences of violence that are far-reaching and long-lasting, even further than the right to life. According to a recent study, for instance, by the Inter-American Development Bank, it estimated that the costs of violence and crime amounted to the equivalent to 3.5% of the Latin American GDP per year, which is obviously important. And that high public and private expenditure on ensuring security in Latin America and the Caribbean is equivalent to what the region spends annually on infrastructure. So there's also an issue about police control, particularly when those police forces are private. This is, I think, sort of a big brush, sort of big picture of where the region is at. I'm obviously very happy to sort of go down in detail to country cases, but I'll finish by saying, out of that context and engaging with a couple of organizations, particularly Garapé in the case of Brazil, Fundación Ideas para la Paz in the case of Colombia, and Mexico Evalúa in the case of Mexico, we engaged around 50 different organizations in what we called a region-wide campaign to prioritize homicide reduction as a public policy that should be discussed and engaged by decision makers and local politicians. It was really interesting to see just 4 years back that none of the countries had any sort of public plans to address and reduce violent deaths across the region, which was obviously sort of a big policy gap that we wanted to talk about. And so, the campaign that we rolled out had that objective, right, to open up the conversation and sort of bring a little bit more evidence to this conversation.
So thanks, Aram. I think that certainly is an eye-opening depiction of the challenges and the starting point as you described it, and you touched on that campaign. I think it would be interesting if you could perhaps dig a little bit more into both as it relates to the campaign and also the work that you've done on symbolic reparation, how it is that you've been seeking to center communities in thinking about innovations and solutions, and some takeaways from that.
Sure, and I should say that this was a really interesting open conversation that we had with many other funders across the region, including the State Department through USAID, and other bilateral organizations that do bilateral cooperation, and we ended up with a sort of meta study on what does evidence point at to reduce violence, which we split in different categories, right? Interventions targeting people directly, interventions targeting places, interventions targeting facilitators, which in this case are sort of enablers or instruments that facilitate homicidal violence, and interventions targeting institutions, which is sort of the wider view, right? And throughout that meta study, what we found are a couple of policies that have evidence, or moderate to strong evidence of working. In the case of engaging with people, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is used across the region by a couple of countries in the States, quite broadly, has moderate data sort of supporting the use of it, but it has a high impact when it is implemented. Preventing recidivism and working with sort of social reintegration programs for people coming out of prison, and then focusing in particular interventions such as policies for femicide prevention, right? So focusing on particular forms of violence. What's very well known in the US is as focused deterrence, right? And there's a statistic in the case of Latin America that over 90% of homicides are focused in about 4% of the region's streets. And so, when you are able to sort of define geographically where violence takes place, you can, make interventions by the state that are very specific. And then last but not least, and there's good evidence of that, particularly in Colombia and Central America, conflict mediation, right? How do you engage with social leaders that are able to sort of intervene, particularly when, as I said before, there is very low trust or legitimacy by the state to intervene. Quickly, in the case of places, interventions in hotspots, which, again, geographically defined specific times, particular people that are implicated in crime, and how to sort of intervene with them. Urban interventions, and what's known in the US is broken windows, which is sort of how do you better the social space and the impact that has in crime commission. And of course, the participation of social leaders, again, and the community itself for that to work. In the case of facilitators, we've already touched on that, so I won't speak much more, but responsible gun and ammunition regulation, measures to regulate alcohol, particularly in certain days at certain times. It has been studied in Colombia and Guatemala. Sundays are particularly high for homicides. There seems to be sort of an added stress amongst everyone, really. I was going to say people who commit or kill people, but I guess generally, right, everyone, Sundays are a difficult day. And so if you add on to that the availability of certain drugs and guns and ammunition, then the possibility of killings rises, and other strategies for sort of reducing drug-related violence. I'll finish with institutions, and then I'll connect to the symbolic reparation very quickly. In the case of institutions, sort of the strengthening of oversight and investigation of homicide, I think, and even if the state in itself doesn't sort of provide the delivery of more cases that are judicialized, at least providing the perception through big cases that is going on, I think has an impact in the reduction of the crime itself, as more people believe that justice is being served. The strengthening of police focus, capacities, and community relations. And I think, contrary to the conversation that has been going in the US over the past 6 to 10 months around sort of defunding the police and gun and police reform, in the case of Latin America, most police forces are already defunded in a way, in the sense of, most money goes towards the military forces and militarized forces rather than the police. And so I think it's an interesting conversation to be had, particularly with US people, how to sort of reinvent let's engage with the police in a different way from a community perspective is something that is, even though it comes from different places, it's a common conversation in Latin America and the US. Early prevention focused on families and parents, access to social and economic opportunity for high-risk groups, and strengthening of local community capacities for violence reduction. Within this last particularly, and I'll connect to the symbolic reparation, even though it is a tricky, from a legal perspective, a tricky entry point for several communities that have had ongoing violence for decades at this point, and the state is not able to provide more justice either because proof or research in terms of the cases has been lost throughout time. The use of symbolic reparation comes handy, right, as a strategic tool. It's been more used in the case of some South American countries such as Brazil, Argentina, or Chile that had dictatorships. And when coming out of the dictatorship era and the establishment of democracy, several of those countries sort of instrumented, monuments, graffiti or other forms of art, even tolerance or memory museums, right, that are able to speak about what went on at a particular geography or to a particular community as a way to sort of re-engage with the community and give the sense that there's a social need for pardoning and for building peace, right? There's a lot of really interesting research in several actually Ivy League universities in the US about when and how those interventions work and when they don't. And I'm again happy to go in depth about that later. But just broadly to say, a tool that is there in our toolbox that I think should be used more broadly in particular cases. Again, you don't want to give the sense that you're just completely skipping serving justice and just coming in at the end and sort of saying, let's just pardon each other. But that allows sort of a different interaction and a different conversation to take place, which I think is important in the sense of sort of building new narrative that is able to, or that helps both decision makers, but also communities to sort of engage in a conversation that is different from the polarized, right? The state is not doing its job, and on top of it, it's sort of committing extrajudicial killings, and then the community putting itself in this sort of, nothing I can do kind of place. So how do we re-engage in that, and how do we rekindle that conversation?
Amazing, thanks, Aram. And I fully expect there may be more questions. And as Michael noted, we encourage any of you, if you have questions, to drop them into the chat. We've devoted time at the end for questions, and certainly welcome your questions as we're going. I'd like Andy now to maybe circle back to an issue that Eric touched on in passing, namely that all-important issue of social networks. And you've done some incredible work and research around mapping of social networks and how we use that when we think about gun violence, violence more generally, through what has been called the N3 initiative that hopefully you can describe as well. So talk to us about that research and what that mapping has been able to do.
Sure, and thank you for having me. It was really great to hear the panelists on a lot of things that are interconnected, because that's all we see, our networks, where I spend most of my times. But first of all, so N3, the Northwestern Neighborhood Network Initiative, we're a university-based research center that really tries to understand the connections among people, organizations, and neighborhoods to try to identify strategies that advance the sort of safety and well-being of communities, and especially around issues of public safety. Importantly, and I'll come back to this sort of at the end of the talk, we really try to, in all of our work, have an engaged process, which is we have particular partners, community partners, civic partners, and from the questions we ask to collecting the information to even analyzing things side by side, we try to do that from start to finish to make sure what we're doing is not just cool science, and I do love cool science, but actually can be impactful for our partners and in particular neighborhoods. We're still young, we're still learning, there's a lot to do. Just one word on this, or a couple thoughts on this idea of social networks. So when I say social networks, I don't mean social media, I actually mean the relationships among people, who you're connected with, and how it affects what you feel, think, and do. And there's a whole branch of science, including in public health, which is sort of what you wanted me to touch on today, that measures these networks and has and understands its impact on all sorts of behaviors and opinions and attitudes. And who you're connected to, it affects what you buy, it affects who you vote for, it affects who you marry. It also affects the spread of information and resources and disease. And so at N3, we've been taking network science and applying it in a bunch of different spaces, but actually one of the spaces, which I won't talk about today, but I'm happy to do later, is something that Deanna mentioned, which is police violence. So everything I'm going to talk about today about neighborhood violence completely aligns with police violence. And by the way, police violence is neighborhood violence. But most of our work to date has been focusing on sort of neighborhood violence, and in particular, who gets shot, and how do we figure that out using information that we have and actually aligns with many of the strategies that Aram has talked about. And so I'll just kind of frame this way, and I'll probably, you might have to interrupt me to kind of get me back on track. But when we think about public health and we think about networks in public health, I actually want to just take a minute to talk about COVID. And there are two ways to understand the current epidemic. The first is when we think about the communities most impacted by COVID. They're the same communities that were most impacted by the surge in gun violence in 2020. They're the ones that have the records for low birth weight, high infectious disease. They're the ones impacted by gerrymandering the most, disinvestment, you name it. It's the same communities year after year after year. And it's because all of these big policies and politics for several hundred years have decided who can live and play and learn where and with whom, right? Which means if we don't continue to keep that in the forefront, that the next epidemic will affect the same communities and the epidemic after that, and so on and so on and so on. So even within COVID, and I think you'll see where I pivot with this, as we're trying to drive down rates today, which we got to do, right? Everybody wants to drive down it. So we got to wear masks. So you have to focus on individual behaviors and social behaviors, but that won't solve the bigger problems. So let's just acknowledge that and never forget that. So even as we're driving things down, which we do with gun violence, that the short-term strategies, which we know work or don't work, we can't just mask us from the long-term plan. We do have to kind of do everything all at once with limited resources and budget shortfalls and all that kind of stuff. So there has to be agenda setting and priorities and so on. So that's the sort of the broad picture of things. And my team and I, for the past decade, have been looking at the actual networks of individuals in neighborhoods to try to figure out who gets shot. And we've done this in a dozen or so cities in the United States. And I want to kind of give you a little bit of the lessons that we've learned and kind of make a context for what this matters for how we approach things. The first thing, and again, Deanna already said this, that even within neighborhoods most impacted by gun violence, the people who are involved represent a tiny portion of any community. And that has massive implications for the types of strategies and what it means. So that's key. And I'll show you this in a second. The second element is that exposure matters. So just like exposure in COVID matters, exposure to violence is horrific across the board, from trauma to learning to physical health to recovering. All of this matters and it has a huge impact. It also has a massive impact on whether you yourself are a victim of gunshot injuries. So when people around you are being shot, your probability skyrockets during these moments. And it becomes important to realize when we can intervene. And the last thing I'm going to say before I show one of these images, and Miriam, I apologize for kind of just carrying straight forward here, is that it's contagious. And I don't mean in the political catchphrase sense. I mean, gun violence literally spreads in a way that looks like an epidemic, which has implications for intervention along the way. So I'm sure you heard Chicago, like many other cities in 2020, had an uptick. It's the largest single uptick in gun homicides and gun violence in the last 20 plus years. I want to show you one image, and this is an image of a social network in Chicago. And it's the dots in this network are actually people. They're not risk factors. They're humans, right? And this is a network that unfolded over 4 weeks, essentially between Father's Day and the 4th of July. And the big red nodes are 4 victims from that time period. And those connections are the connections among their associates. And there are 25 other victims in this network, that victims from the previous 24 months that were shot. And so you can see the sort of pathways in between these individuals. And those 4 people were shot within 10 days of each other. So within this network, in this community, where they are, being hit by COVID and everything else, in this 10-day span, 4 people were shot and killed, and hundreds and dozens of people around them were impacted. Their lives were changed essentially forever. And the thing is, this is just one neighborhood in Chicago during a really bad year, and the rest of the city looks something like this. But here's the thing. 2/3 of any shooting in Chicago happens in these sorts of small networks. And it's decidedly tragic, but not random, right? The patterns are stuck in place for all of the big reasons we've kind of discussed and talked about, and trying to figure out what we do about it is kind of where we are now, right? So we've been partnering with some local nonprofits, and I'll talk about what this will mean in a minute. I'm sure it'll come up in Q&A, but it's how do we figure out how to get resources here, right? In the middle of the pandemics. How, in the COVID sense, how do we get masks? How do we get other things they might need? Food, eviction support, right? How do we get those to the right people in the right time? And what does that mean for gun violence intervention? What we've been doing is trying to take these sorts of models and working with street outreach workers, right? Violence preventionists who themselves have been impacted by gun violence. Many have lived through injuries, and incarceration, and involvement with street organizations, and try to help amplify their work, because there aren't many of them in the city of Chicago. There's about 170 of them in a city that has 900 street crews, 10,000 plus individuals that are sort of in these networks, right? How do we make sure they can respond quickly, efficiently, and have the resources that they need? Because here's the trick. You're never, ever going to arrest your way out of this, right? You're not going to prosecute your way out of this. In fact, the lessons from networks is that you can actually, and again, Aram sort of alluded to this, it's actually about narrowing, then even in the criminal justice context, understanding that fewer, more strategic contacts are way better than the opposite, right? There's sort of things like loitering laws, stop and frisk, do the opposite of what the science tells us in this space, which is fewer, smarter sorts of contacts when you're in the criminal justice space. And when you do have those sorts of contacts, it's important to understand how they are fair and just and transparent, and how they can coordinate, say, with other sorts of outreach and violence prevention efforts.
Thanks, Andy. And I think we may later want to come back to that question of how we use that notion of strategic contacts and what it is that we're trying to promote in thinking about metrics of success. And linking to Deanna's question or Deanna's observation that when we also recognize some of the challenges around police engagement, realizing that the contacts, often what works best, if we really aren't trying to arrest our way out of these kinds of problems, are not police-driven contacts, that we need to look to those who can best deliver the kind of response that we're looking to emulate, that we're looking to build out. So I don't know if you want to add any quick thoughts on either of those, Andy, and in a minute, then I'll turn it over, Eric, to you to talk about the work your office has done.
Right. So let me add two thoughts there, and I appreciate the question. It's a great question. The first is a sociological secret. That's not a secret to anybody, but the vast majority of fights and disputes never escalate beyond that. So networks actually can mitigate things. They can also go horribly wrong, right? And so a third party can say to somebody, you know, if Miriam and I, you know, are out and somebody starts a fight, Miriam can say, Andy, let's get out of here. Or Miriam can say, Andy, how are you going to let them talk to you that way? And if Miriam has a gun, everything changes, right? So part of what we know, we call this informal social control in sociology, is that these networks are interwoven in really complex way. You know, your neighbor's not just a gang member, it's also your neighbor, maybe your cousin or your coworker. And so understanding the sort of embedded nature of these things can also, and because more often than not, they're leveraged. So this does come back to, you know, understanding how we can amplify stuff that we know works. And street outreach is an example of this, is because they are in the neighborhood, they're in the networks, they know this, but they can't see everything and be everywhere. So is there a way that individuals that are already doing this can be better, or hopefully help them in their position? And if it doesn't, you shouldn't do it, by the way. And I will say, though, even within the law enforcement context, good cops know these networks too, and can navigate these networks in different ways than cops that don't know the networks or don't know neighborhoods, which is one of the things you often hear from residents. A big complaint is they don't know the neighborhood, they're not like us, they don't understand these things. And that is a network problem, not understanding it. On the police violence side, one of the things we've been looking at, of course, are, you know, officers that are engaging in violence. And guess what? They hang out together and they know each other and they learn from each other. They learn bad behavior from each other. And in some ways, this is turning these sorts of metrics on those sorts of behaviors. Doesn't fix the institution of policing whatsoever, actually. I mean, it does, but it could reduce someone getting harmed. And as we think about these larger issues around reimagining what this looks like, it's important that we stop people from doing bad things, the police officers who are engaging and perpetuating violence. So I think that overlap is I mean, 100% on that. It's an interesting place. And in many instances, you know, they overlap in specific interactions. In Chicago, historically, around public housing projects, you know, the cops and the networks of shootings probably overlap tremendously. in terms of knowing each other, interacting with each other, stops, contacts, arrests, and so on.
Thanks, Andy. So Eric, I want to turn it over to you because I know that your thinking and innovations that you've put in place in your office have been greatly impacted by Andy's work. And if you could maybe take a couple minutes and talk about the innovations and the approaches that you've put in place in your office with the starting point around, you know, how do we, again, embrace that notion that the criminal legal system is often not the best response or the right response to these issues. I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Sorry about that. So Andy's work has been transformational in helping me sort of think through my life experiences and think about how do I take, knowing what I knew as a young person growing up in a community that had, you know, tremendous amount of crime, and now using the ability that I have to focus resources from my office to deal with that. And so what we're trying to do, quite frankly, is new. We will continue to be responsive to the work that the police department does, and there's a certain amount of reactive work that DAs do in investigating and prosecuting cases. But so much of what the work can be by a prosecutor is, you know, preventative and restorative in nature. And so what we want to do, and we're piloting things in different places, and we have different programs, but what they have in common is that it's meant to be community-led, anti-violence preventative actions that minimize contact with law enforcement, minimize the tethering of services to the criminal justice system, and minimize the fact that at the end, someone has to be punished. It's trying to let the community have the ability to have a, you know, the resources that the DAs can bring to the table and help direct it. So one of the things that we're doing, for example, in Brownsville is a number of either active or former gang members were really concerned that the amount of violence in that network had really gotten out of control. Young people were shooting at each other and killing each other in really historical numbers. And we've seen that surge in America, and we've seen it in Brooklyn. I mean, they were concerned that things that typically did not lead to gun violence had now been leading to more and more gun violence. And so they came to some of the community leadership, some of the people who work on violence interruption, and said, what we really could use is a way of deadening these beefs, or dealing with these beefs and these conflicts before they led to more shootings. And so what we are trying to do is provide the resources to make sure that we can provide training, some of the money, but also giving the agency to community stakeholders and community leaders to deal with these issues without bringing the prosecutor's office to the forefront in solving these. And so they look like what we just talked about. It looks like people who have the ability to and have the credibility in their communities to bring people together, getting the training and bringing on other mediators and people who can do restorative practices to try to prevent some of this violence from escalating and trying to reduce it, and acknowledging that the police are not the best people to do that within these communities, that the preventative work has to start with people who live in the neighborhood, who know the people and have the credibility to do that. And so we're working on different programs, but all with the same concept of getting these networks together and having the leadership. So we have two rival gang members who are like at some point were like the heads of their respective organizations, who've actually come together and said, we're going to prevent the shootings from continuing this. So a lot of our shootings in Brooklyn were not even about actual disputes that we really in law enforcement understand. They were not about money. They were not about drugs. They were not about the things that I think a lot of people always assume the shootings are about. They were about minor slights. They were about disrespect. They were about issues that dealt with who was, in whose space at the right time or the wrong time. And so really understanding that if we have the right violence interrupters, the right people working in the community, and they were resourced, they don't need us to do that. Brownsville, Brooklyn did something very interesting. Recently, we had a 5 days, the Brownsville Alliance, Safety Alliance had 5 days where the police agreed to take a step back and let community stakeholders get involved. And a lot of the violence interrupter groups and other organizations took over a period of blocks and did a lot of the enforcement there. And we were able to have 5 days in Brownsville with a lesser law enforcement approach, with the sense that all these community organizations and stakeholders, my office and people who did social work, were in the neighborhood providing resources and treating that neighborhood more traditionally like a middle-class neighborhood gets treated. Less enforcement. The police were there if there was an emergency, but the day-to-day dealing of problems was being handled by people who were empowered and were resourced to help. And I think that is a very different approach from a prosecutor's office. But what, the way I've described it to my people here in the office, and I work in a big office, it's 1,300 employees. I say we're sharing some of the power that has been entrusted in the agency back to the communities that we're looking to serve, and something that is not often done. But we are emphasizing violence prevention, and we're emphasizing the fact that much of what causes violence is really not understood by the general public. They think it's about things that it's not really about. It's about people living in conditions that really are inhumane, and all the stressors that people have, and people act out. And to Aram's position about the things that lead to violence, he talked about all the things that lead to violence in Latin America. It was interesting hearing him talk about that, because I felt like he was talking about Brooklyn. We were looking at youth and unemployment. We're looking at really crappy jobs that people have and no social mobility. Folks never get out of that neighborhood, right? People stay and grow up, and as generations, social mobility is very low, too many guns, and incredibly low clearance rates that cause people to believe that they can act with impunity. And so, the solutions to a lot of that sound like we really have to engage our people and resource them and give them the tools that they need in order to create a safer neighborhood for themselves. And my office and the police department, we will be there as needed, but we need to kind of take a step back, provide resources so people can take action. In terms of a lot of different things, food insecurity, a lot of other things, what we've seen in Brooklyn during COVID is that if we actually resource our community to do things, people know how to feed their own community. People know how to get health services. They know how to do the vaccination. If you get the COVID shots to the community, they can get it to the seniors. They can do things. Communities actually know how to take care of themselves if they're provided with the ability to do so. And I think it's the same for safety. We, for just so long, have just said, you can't do it. It requires the DA's office, it requires the police. And we know, at least here in Brooklyn, that the law enforcement authorities are, in many, many regards, it's not that people don't want any police, but they want policing that treats them fairly. And since we don't have that, the trust in our justice system and our legal system is super low. And like I said earlier, Miriam, I would imagine about 70% of the cases that my office is involved in is, we're chasing after witnesses or victims to participate. That is not their natural reaction. And we always just assume it's because they're afraid. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's because what we're giving them is not what they're looking for.
Thank you so much, DA Gonzalez. And that actually dovetails beautifully with what I wanted to ask Deanna. So when Deanna and I were speaking last week in preparation for this panel, we were talking about what it means to have voices at the table. And Deanna said to me, we don't need voices at the table, they are the whole damn table. And I would love, Deanna, if you could just share, I've been thinking about that ever since you said it, and would love for you to share that piece of wisdom with our audience.
I say that because as formerly incarcerated people, as people who come from those communities most marginalized, oppressed, that have been labeled high violence, I think DA Gonzalez said it. We know how to handle our community and feed our community. We've just never been entrusted with the resources to do so. And Andrew was speaking about the mapping of social networks, and it was warming my heart because I got introduced to social network mapping back in 2011, but it was always around the fatalities, right? And I kept saying, why are you showing me shootings when we're supposed to be preventing shootings? And there were no resources. And what I identified at that time was the people on that map that Andrew showed that had actually previously been a victim of gunshot or been involved in gunshot, and their networks needed the same resources that formerly incarcerated people needed as well. So I was able to build resources around people's social network who had never encountered the incarceration system, because that's part of our goal, right? How do we divert people? How do we divert people from violence? How do we divert people from interaction with law enforcement is what this whole panel is about. And I think the demonstration that DA Gonzalez and Andrew both presented was the ability to trust the people from those communities and giving them the resources to provide to those people. Again, Andrew talked about, think about COVID. Just getting masks and PPP to those most marginalized communities can be a strategy and not trusted by who's delivering the mask or who's delivering the vaccine, right? But when you trust the people who have come from those communities, who have encountered that system, you get a different response. And that's traditionally what this system, what people in power have not done. When we're saying formerly incarcerated people need to lead violence reduction and we're former gang members, it's just seen as an initiative, but it's really a paraprofessional. It's really bringing the expertise to the table to solve the problems of the community. And DA Gonzalez said it best. The reason we don't show up as witnesses, because we already experienced what the system is getting ready to impact on another individual, and we don't want them to go through that. Most people who have been victims of violence or who may have lost a member of their family to violence always want to make sure another family doesn't feel it. They really don't want to see somebody go to prison for 30 years. How do I help that person to make sure they never impose that level of pain on another individual? It's always around restorative. And we've looked at restorative justice as a program. It's not a program. It's a philosophy and a way of life. If we think that people can heal and we give them the resources to get down to the core of the issue, we actually can address some of the issues that are going on. So when I say we're the whole damn table, is, yeah, people have started bringing us into the conversations. Yes, people have started saying, so what do you think? We are saying, we want to design the policies, the initiatives, and the actions in our communities, and you support us. How the initiative, the 5-day initiative in Brownsville, where they said, we're going to take a back seat. We're going to be here on the outskirts if you need us, but we're going to let you take the lead on this to help this community in the best way that's possible. That's a different thinking, because we haven't been entrusted to being able to provide for ourselves or save ourselves, right? Everybody has come in and said, this is what your community needs. These are the resources you need. And the analogy I like to use if you guys remember, mass incarceration, collateral consequences, all they need is a job. And we were saying, but we don't have a place to live. Can't even get a birth certificate. But nobody was paying attention to that. They thought if you just get people who are formerly incarcerated a job, recidivism will go down. Well, it didn't. We just committed survival crimes when we left the job because we still needed to pay for a hotel that night and we didn't have money because the job didn't pay us for 2 weeks. But nobody was listening to us. So when I say we're the whole damn table, it is we're sitting at the table and everybody else who has actually been directing it is sitting on the outskirts listening and then strategizing on how they're going to get us the resources to execute.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, it's really powerful and I appreciate you sharing that. I just, I know your organization is doing some amazing work around just this issue. I'd, love to give you a moment just to share some of the work that you in particular are doing. I mean, I know you're doing amazing work with vaccinations. Can share some of that and some of the work you're doing with violence interruption.
So a couple of things that we've been doing, just what we're talking about on this call. In the middle of COVID, we know the administration, every governor across the country is focused on getting people vaccinated, reducing the number of people testing positive for COVID, but they never thought about a strategy to the most marginalized and oppressed communities. They never thought about a communication strategies for people in correctional facilities and how they're going to get them to opt in to actually be vaccinated to take their lives, because we're still living on the oppressive distrust of historically what has happened to Black and brown people, right? So we started creating PSAs for inside correctional facilities. Someone asked me to write a proposal and I had to go to my team and I was like, I can't write on a proposal that I'm gonna go to the shot callers in a correctional facility and explain it to them and then have them disseminate the information, because that doesn't register as normal. But for people who are credible messengers who have been there, we know if we want to get something through a prison system and we want to get people on board with something, we do what DA Gonzalez did. We go to the shot callers. We go to the shot callers, we convince and educate them, and they disseminate the information. That is non-traditional when you're talking about a correctional facility who tries to put people who have power of a voice in solitary confinement to manage their incarceration. Instead of saying, how do I change that power? How do I change that connection to everybody in this facility to actually be in a more powerful position that actually helps the facility and actually keeps us safe inside this correctional facility? So we're doing that around the vaccines. Another thing that we're doing is, there's been this huge narrative that's been lost from last summer called defund the police. It never was a controlled narrative. And it was never saying we're taking law enforcement off the streets or we're not doing it. It's saying invest in our communities. Those resources that D.I. Gonzalez was talking about, if we're shifting from how we incarcerate, we're incarcerating less people, we're arresting less people, there's a cost savings to that. Where should that cost savings go? It should go to those resources that they talked about of empowering the community, because more of the resources that go to the community, the more we're going to keep reducing the number of people we arrest in those communities. But that narrative got lost. So how do we control the narrative and making sure we have a strategy to educate the broader community? Because everybody wants thriving communities, but it's language, and language is important. Just as formerly incarcerated people, we push on language of inmates, convicts, and different things, because when you put a negative connotation to it, it has a negative response of how you respond to me.
Thank you so much, Deanna. And I know we're running a little short on time. I would love just to get to a couple questions that we have coming. So for Andrew and Aram, I would love to just ask the two of you, what have you learned in the last, I guess we're approaching 14 months now of dealing with the pandemic and the recent increases in violence? How has that impacted your thinking, the work that you do, and anything else you can share with the panel?
Who's going to go first? Okay, I'll actually say one thing which related to a question that sort of was asked on email, which is, especially as a researcher, which is, how do we measure things and what does success look like? I actually want to go again. Deanna's like taking all the good points because she knows, but like, who rose to the call in many of the neighborhoods to hand out PPEs? It was the street outreach workers. So the demand for their efforts to do violence prevention went up. They were under more scrutiny. And at the same time, they were the ones that were handing out food, making connections, handing out PPEs. They were getting COVID themselves, right? And so one of the things we've really tried to do working with them, again, is just to recognize that, which lets us know that this, and again, I like counting things. It's important that we count things. It's important that we look at short-term numbers and long-term numbers, but one of the key metrics we should be looking at are connecting people, right? Are they making connections? Are they building things, or are they amplifying things, as opposed to just looking at the value of, and again, I'm thinking from a policy perspective, we're going to give money to this, we're going to do that program or that policy, again, to this point of what is there and how can we improve it or help, you know, again, like from my role, how can I make sure that I'm looking at the right things and getting that there. But that's the one thing that we look at, is the idea of violence prevention is just focusing at numbers is a short-term game that misses the larger point of what the work actually is. And so that's one of the real central things. And again, this sort of, and I started my conversation with this, and I'll end my conversations with it too, is we do need to drive rates of COVID down. We need to have gun violence rates go down, but like that, those bigger issues, we can't have off our sight. They have to kind of be there. You know, and I had mentioned sort of, you can't arrest your way or prosecute your way out of these networks. I mean, we've tried, like, and there's reasons why we can't do that. And it's all the reasons everyone had said. And, you know, this goes back, I've even got a cool paper on this with Al Capone. We thought we had fixed organized crime when we took out Al Capone. Guess what's still around? Organized crime, right? So even at these far extreme ends, it doesn't, that's an inappropriate, which doesn't mean it doesn't need to, things don't need to be in that space, but to the point of, what does this moment have us look at when we want to know what public safety should be? And so that it has pushed my thinking a lot, and just inspired by the people around us and the people that we continue to work with. So
I'll build on that in one way, on the one hand on data and sort of making visible some sub parts of a phenomenon. I think, you know, Latin America is, as many other geographies around the global south, lacking on numbers, which makes it difficult to make decisions and sort of respond to reality. And that is particularly true for populations that are not the majority in most countries, right? And I think, again, paired with the conversation in the US around sort of police reform, Latin America had throughout the pandemic, I think, a couple of really interesting conversations. One that was coming from before, which is sort of the gender perspective on violence, not only speaking about sort of intimate and house violence, but also and gender-based violence, but also sort of street harassment and the policies and programs in place to sort of respond to that. Similarly, for particular sort of sexual diversity populations, you know, Honduras is the global capital of murders for trans people, for instance, and you know, there's no you know, response on behalf of the state. So that's sort of the view of gender. But then the second one is one related to race and probably in the case of Latin America, class as well, which, you know, showed up throughout the pandemic. People being killed or beaten by police forces for not wearing a mask across the region, really, you know, so many examples. And when you go to the depth of it, and again, here, I think it connects really interestingly with the conversation in the US. It has a lens or an analysis to be made from a race and class perspective, which, you know, sort of asks for the question, what are policies, protocols in the case of police forces to sort of engage with particular populations, and we know that, for instance, from Brazil. I think a short way of saying this is actually naming Amnesty's international campaign for homicide reduction in Brazil. The title of the campaign is Black young men alive. You know, if that doesn't tell you who's majorly targeted by violence, you know, it concentrates in particular populations, which, again, to say it short, are populations that are irrelevant or not important for mainstream conversations and for politicians. Of course, it shouldn't be that way. But you know, why is it possible that so many people go killed across the region? Essentially because those being killed are people that, you know, nobody cares about them. And so how do we turn that conversation around? How do we make the state and obviously society at large sort of care for the lives of those people? And I think, you know, and I'll conclude with this, I think the pandemic sort of surfaced those 2 or 3 particular conversations, the lack of that, the gender, race, and class lenses, but also allowed many of the partners we have across the region to sort of, you know, stop, take hold, and sort of think where to move next strategically. And in that sense, I think this conversation, and thanks again, Miriam and everybody else involved, is very strategic. It comes at a very strategic time.
Thank you so much. I know we're about to get the hook, so I just want to thank all the panelists, Aram, Andrew, Deanna, Eric Gonzalez. Thank you all so much. You work in your service to, you know, all our communities and inspires us. And Miriam, thank you so much to you and the FJP team.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.